So I'd now like to call on our next speaker, Kate Grarock. And Kate is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, and she's been researching the introduction, spread, impact and control of the common myna. Over to Kate.
G'day, I'm Kate. I'm a PhD researcher at ANU. I'm just about to hand in my PhD next month. I'm very happy to speak here today. I'm just skipping through the first few slides. It's just the basic introductory stuff about miners that I think we've already gone through. Basically, my PhD is 5 papers, and I'm just going to go through each of those quite briefly today. They're all in various stages of publication, so if you want more information of them, hopefully they'll be available pretty soon. Until recently, unfortunately, we didn't have strong scientific evidence that the myna really was that bad on the abundance of species. We had studies that showed there was competition with nesting hollows and things like that, but there was no real firm evidence that the myna reduced the number of native birds, so the abundance of native birds, and that's where my PhD project came and is trying to sort of solve some of these unknown problems. But the first part I looked at was the introduction and spread of the common myna in Canberra, to basically look at how the species interacts in the Canberra environment, get a bit of background information on it so we can answer some of the other questions later on. Second part was the impact of the common myna on native birds, and we looked at that in 3 main ways. We basically did a long-term impact using Canberra ornithologist data. Then we did a driver and passenger of change, so looking at the impact the myna has in conjunction with habitat variables. And then once again we looked at competition through cavity nesting. And the final part that my study looks at is the control of the common myna and the work that SciMag are doing on controlling the common myna. So onto the first one is the introduction and spread of the species. This paper is currently under review in the Journal of Environmental Management. So basically there's a lot of literature out there that shows that invasive species follow an invasion process where somehow the species is introduced to the area, transported, then there's this sort of a lag period where they adjust to the new environment. They can die out at this stage, or they can then become established. It tends to be a bit of time, and then they become a population that can start to breed, and then they spread and then perhaps impact. It may not be entirely linear relationship, where impacts could happen as soon as they arrive in the environment, but this is just sort of basically a model for what we use. So basically we just recreated this for the myna in Canberra, and we were lucky to have early paper on the sightings of the species in Canberra and data from Canberra ornithologist group to recreate the invasion of the myna here in Canberra. So from this data we were able to basically track the establishment of the myna in Canberra and get some pretty maps where basically the red is where the myna exists at different time periods throughout its introduction and establishment in Canberra. Then from this data, basically we just graphed the rate of spreading through the environment, producing a graph pretty much like this, which shows the years along the bottom and then the area established, the cumulative area. And the sort of the initial part of the graph that's quite steep is where the human introductions were occurring, and the species spread quite quickly at the start. And then if you can see opposite about 4, the 4 mark on the area established, the spreading rate actually plateaued for a brief sort of period where the species was kind of getting used to the environment, learning where to forage and all those things, and then it started the natural spread began, and then they spread all through Canberra until they plateaued at the top where they reached all of the suburbs in Canberra. We also did the same with COG data. We looked at the population size and we broke Canberra into northern region, southern region and 2 central regions, and just sort of had a look at how the population grew over this period. And I guess from all that data, then we can get some very basic sort of population dynamic information from the species and learn a little bit about how quickly the species can spread, how quickly the species can grow, and things like that that really help with management. So just basically, The lag in population growth, so there was about a period of 3 years after the natural introductions stopped, where the species just kind of didn't really grow in population, just kind of stayed at like a pretty steady number and then started to increase. And then the maximum rate of population growth was an average of about 24 birds per kilometre squared per year, which is pretty quick. And then the maximum population size is 205 birds per square kilometre. Noting that this is from Canberra ornithologist group data, which I guess it estimates people survey for the highest number of birds they've seen over a period. So the numbers could be a little higher than, say, transect counts and things like that, because it's actually the maximum number of birds they've seen in an area. So basically the key findings from that, the invasion sequence was quite similar to our theoretical invasion, and we saw each of the stages occurring for the myna as we would expect from invasion theory. This sort of led us to believe that perhaps the conceptual model could be used with basic species information as a useful tool to understand what a species is doing throughout its invasion. Obviously, you're not going to be able to predict what's going to happen, but it can show you some just sort of basic key steps as what could happen as a species invades a new environment. And this could lead to enhanced management for different species. So that's just sort of a brief overview of just what's happened with the myna in Canberra. The next one is where we look at the impact of the species in Canberra. So once again, we were very lucky to have the data from Canberra Ornithologist Group, which gave us a very long-term data set on what the birds were doing prior to the myna being introduced to Canberra, and then what the birds were doing after the myna was introduced to Canberra. And so with that data, once again, we used the 4 broad regions of Canberra, the north, 2 central and a southern, and we looked at a whole heap of variables of what was going on in the environment over the 29, 30 years of the Canberra ornithologist data. So we looked at dwellings, so how did Canberra change over that 30-year period? So obviously the environment has a big impact on what's happening with your bird numbers, the amount of vegetation, the weather variables and things like that. So we put all that into a model and asked it pretty much, what were the birds doing, the native birds doing before the myna was here? What were the birds doing after the myna was here, were introduced? And then taking into account how Canberra's developed over that period. And from that we got a big output of interesting model outputs, which are not terribly interesting in terms of viewing. But we basically found negative impacts on the sulphur-crested cockatoo, the crimson rosella and laughing kookaburra of our cavity nesting species. The small bird species, we found superb fairy wren, striated pardalote, woolly wagtail, grey fantail, magpie lark, silver eye and common blackbirds were negatively impacted by the establishment of the common myna. As a control, we also modelled large bird species and we didn't find any negative impacts, so that I guess sort of indicated that our model was on the right track. So yeah, our key finding is there is a negative relationship between the establishment of the common myna and the long-term abundance of some cavity nesting and small bird species. However, I guess as the earlier talk touched on, my management prioritisation may still remain a contentious issue given the very limited resources for managing certain introduced species. So there still needs to be a bit of work done on prioritisation of how big is that impact, what sort of resources should be directed to that management. And then the next part, we basically looked at I guess a thing that's called drivers and passengers. So there's a bit of literature out there that suggests that some invasive species are very much attracted to human or modified habitats and do really well in these modified habitats. So we wanted to see how much was the myna influenced by this human development, and how much was the impact of human development on birds. So was the myna driving all this decline, or was also human habitat, human habitat modification playing a big role as well? To do this, basically, we set up 15 areas in Canberra where we did, transect surveys for birds through the urban areas and through the nature reserves. So basically, we set it up. We had urban areas, nature reserves, and then also within the nature reserves, we had 3 different levels of tree density. So high tree density, medium tree density, and low tree density. And we wanted to look at the impact because there's some evidence to suggest that mynas tend to avoid higher tree density areas, preferring lower tree density areas and urban areas. So this is just sort of an example of what our high tree density looks like, our medium and our low, and they were statistically different from one another. And then once again, we threw in these variables to see what was happening with the species. Not a terribly interesting graph when you're modelling things, but so basically what we found was that the common myna is primarily a passenger of habitat change. So the species was really strongly affected by the tree density, and also very strongly affected by urban versus nature reserves. So we found huge numbers of them in the urban areas, and then lesser numbers in the reserves. And then as tree density increased, the numbers further dropped. The really interesting thing about that, we also found the opposite pattern occurred for the crimson rosella and many of the other native species. So they preferred, a lot of them preferred the reserve areas, whereas the myna preferred the suburban. So yeah, from that it really showed the strong relationship that the myna is primarily a passenger of habitat change. But we also did find some indication that it may drive the decline of the gang cockatoo, crimson rosella, and some small, and the abundance and richness of some small bird species. And I guess it just highlights the importance of looking at habitat modification and invasive species impact together. It's not as clear as the myna is decimating bird populations. We also need to look at what's happening with the environment as well, because that plays a massive role on what both natives and invasive species are doing. And the next one, where we look at nest boxes. Basically, we wanted to look again at the impact that the myna was having in the nesting boxes on native species. So we looked at the impact on crimsons and eastern rosellas in nesting boxes. Basically, we put up 225 nest boxes in the same nesting reserves, in the same nature reserves as we surveyed, with the transect surveys in nature reserves. 15 boxes in each reserve. We went around and checked them every 4 weeks in the nesting period to look at sort of the number of boxes used by mynas, the number of boxes used by native birds, the number of times that mynas kicked out native birds from nesting and things like that. Found some pretty cool. This is. If I can go back, this is how we check the nest boxes. Basically, this is a small pole with a camera on the end and then a video camera at the bottom, and you can quite easily check it. It's a very quick, easy process that doesn't really disturb the bird terribly, so that was a handy little procedure. And then you get sort of footage such as this in the nest box. You can see sort of the number of chicks or the eggs, what species is using it. So that's a myna eggs and chick. Their mynas are a bit older and uglier, and then they're getting a bit more myna-like. And then, so this is pretty data rich, but basically, once again, we saw that the myna abundance was strongly related to the tree density in the nature reserve, so the high, medium, and low. So there was very few mynas in the high, medium, and low. They start to become more and more mynas. The next nest boxes used were also influenced by the tree density in the reserve. So high tree density areas, there was not that many miners nesting, whereas low tree density areas, there are a lot of miners nesting. Egg success, sort of related to tree density. Average eggs per clutch, we got 4.5 to 4. Interestingly, we found some nests with up to 7 eggs, so that's pretty scary, which actually all of them hatched successfully. And the amount of interruptions the common miner did on native species nesting also increased. It was higher in low tree density areas. However, that unfortunately was not statistically significant. And I think that's just because of our low sample size. Unfortunately, we didn't actually observe that many times where the miner clearly displaced native birds. And that could just be a factor of our survey period every 4 weeks, perhaps not getting all of the, not seeing it as clearly. Crimson rosellas, once again, they showed an opposite pattern to the minor, so there was high abundance in the higher tree density areas and numbers reducing in the lower tree density areas, and the nest box use followed a similar pattern where there's lots of crimson rosellas nesting in high tree density areas and not many nesting in lower tree density areas. And the Eastern Rosella did something a little bit different. He was a bit more abundant in the medium tree density areas. And from this, basically, we graphed what was happening in terms of the high, medium and low tree densities, and looked at the impact that the number of nest boxes used by the miner, and did that have an impact on the abundance of the rosellas in those areas. And we actually found significant negative relationships. So the first graph on the top is that's for all tree densities, and then the second one is just high tree density, medium and low tree density. And so we actually found, this is for the crimson rosella, that the more nesting by the common miner actually was related to lower abundance of native birds. So that sort of indicated that perhaps this nesting is negatively affecting native, well, crimson rosella in this case. However, it wasn't so clear over the medium tree density areas for crimson rosella. Interestingly, we thought that the low tree density areas were the area where the miner had the biggest impact, and that is, it does indicate that they do have an impact, but in the high tree density, this one at the top here, an increase, say, from 10 to 30% of common miner nesting percentage resulted in a very steep decline in crimson rosella abundance. So perhaps it has a more severe impact in those areas where the native birds prefer to nest. And we found similar things for the eastern rosella, although the relationships weren't as strong and some of them weren't significant. We only found significant over low tree density areas. So key findings: tree density, once again, strongly influenced the abundance and nesting of all species. Low tree density, the common miner dominated nest boxes and impacts the abundance of the crimson eastern rosella. And there's a greater number of nest box interruptions, although it wasn't significant in low tree density areas. And high tree density, there was a more severe negative relationship on the crimson rosella. And I guess that sort of indicates that the importance perhaps of trying to control the miner in areas where it is interacting with threatened species. So I think that's probably one of the key areas that we should be looking at, trying to control miners in areas where they are nesting in areas where threatened species are occurring. Finally, the control of the common miner. So we looked at the data of CIMAG and how trapping influences the abundance of the common miner. So basically we looked at 2 scales of trapping. So we looked at broad scales, once again our northern region and 2 southern region, central and southern regions. And we also looked at the finer scale 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre regions. So we looked at the impact on fine scale regions and broad scale regions on the abundance of the common miner. We also did a little bit of population modelling, just very basic logistic growth model, basically sort of throwing in the rate of population growth from our earlier study and the number of birds caught, to sort of get an indication of how many birds need to be removed at different population sizes. So this is just using Canberra Ornithologist Group data and looking at the growth of the myna, and the black arrow indicates when CIMAG started trapping. So you can actually see in region 2 that I think as a natural population, it started to reduce prior to trapping, and that's just part of like it reaching the carrying capacity in that region, then starting to drop, and then trapping kicked in. Then if we actually graph linear regression with the number of birds, the change in common myna abundance and common myna birds trapped per kilometre squared for the broad scale region, unfortunately we see a negative trend, but it's not statistically significant. However, when we look at the fine scale, we do find a significant negative relationship between common myna trapping and the abundance of the common myna. So that indicates that over our fine scale areas, we definitely are finding a negative relationship between trapping and common myna abundance. But unfortunately, at the broader scale, it's not being seen as clearly. And from looking at our population model, we can sort of see that, for example, at when the population density is about 10 birds per kilometre squared, only about 10 birds per kilometre squared need to be removed to get a significant reduction. However, when the population size gets a lot larger, say at 100 birds per kilometre squared, the actual removal number needs to be up around 40 birds per kilometre squared to get a significant reduction. And then once the birds get up to say 250 birds per kilometre squared, the natural population density regulation kicks in and they'll reduce even without any trapping occurring. So this just sort of feeds a bit of information into perhaps the level of trapping that needs to occur at different population densities. And that indicates that at the lower, the fine scale trapping is occurring at a level of, say, 25 birds per kilometre squared that is actually having a reduction, whereas the broad scale, perhaps there's not enough people trapping and we're not quite getting enough numbers to see this really clear decline in numbers. So yeah, the key finding of that one is that trapping is effective over fine scales. There's no effective, we currently can't see any effect of the trapping over the broader scale, but once again, that's probably just a function of maybe needing more birds removed from the population. And population model sort of indicates that culling of 25 birds per kilometre squared would be a good target for the Canberra population. And population model will sort of lead to a better understanding of how the species interacts with different culling levels, and then better management, and hopefully innovation into perhaps, if they learn to avoid traps and things like that, perhaps different methods to maintain that trapping number or target level that we're aiming for.